For those of you just joining us, we will begin in a moment. Welcome. My name is Piper Chapman, and I am the Assistant Director at Harvard Alumni Travels. Thank you for joining us today for our travel talk, Healing the Community Through Music Post-Pandemic, presented by Dr. Lisa Wong. Before I turn things over to our distinguished speaker, I'd like to review the format for today's Zoom webinar. For the duration of the lecture, your video and microphone will be turned off so we can direct our attention to our speaker. On the bottom of your screen, you will see several buttons to interact with. Please insert your questions in the Q&A box. You will also see a chat box, which is intended for comments, sharing information, and to engage with fellow alumni. To chat the entire audience, please select to all panelists and attendees when submitting your comment. For those of you who would like to hide the chat feature, you may do so by moving the chat to the side of your screen. Closed captioning is available, and you will find it by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical issues, please message our support team by selecting HAA support in the chat. Please note today's 1-hour webinar will be recorded and shared with you. Finally, we appreciate your patience should we experience technological glitches or delays due to the nature of our virtual environment. Please be aware that you can adjust your sound preferences on your own personal devices. In the spirit of travel, I'd like to kick things off by encouraging you to share your location in the chat box so we can see where we're all tuning in from. Let's take a look. Thank you, and keep it coming, please. I am so thrilled to pass this over to Dr. Wong, but first, a brief word about our speaker. Lisa M. Wong is an assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. As a practicing pediatrician, musician, and educator, she is committed to incorporating the arts and humanities into healthy living and lifelong learning. Dr. Wong served for 20 years as president of the Longwood Symphony, the orchestra of Boston's medical community, where she also designed their award-winning Healing Art of Music program. She is a violinist, violist, and pianist. In April of 2012, she published her first book, Scales to Scalpels, Doctors Who Practice the Healing of Arts of Music and Medicine. Lisa, I'm so thrilled to have you with us today to talk about your work. So without further ado, I'd love to pass the mic over to you. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Piper. And hello, everybody. Happy afternoon. Here in Boston, it's a beautiful sunny day, which we're very excited about because we've had a lot of rain. But happy summer, happy July to everybody. And I'm really, really thrilled to be here to talk with you today. What I'd like to talk about is about the role of music in healing our community, in medicine, and also what focus a little bit about what we've been doing during the pandemic. Because even before the pandemic hit, we all know that isolation and loneliness was something that was really on the rise. We all thought that the internet was going to be something to bring us together, but unfortunately, it caused us to feel even more isolated and sort of getting into our screens. And so the big challenge was, now that we are isolated because of the pandemic, how do we use our technology and our screens to bring us back together? And so some of what we did during this year was in that spirit. As Piper mentioned in her her kind introduction, I have spent my life really sort of weaving and braiding together the work of music, of education, and of healing in different ways at different times. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that today. And at the end, I'm going to invite your questions and invite us to all imagine where we will move forward to as we emerge from the pandemic or learn to live with the pandemic, and to bring our world back together again. But to start, I would like to invite you all to take a moment to breathe. I'm going to play a little bit of music live, by Johann Sebastian Bach, music written 400 years ago, and ask you to either you can watch me on the screen or you can turn off your screen. You can close your eyes, but pay attention to what your heart rate is doing, where your mind is flowing, how you're breathing, and how it feels to be with approximately 100 or 200 of us, of the alumni here together, listening to music, even though not in the same space, but in the same virtual space. So I'm going to get my viola now. And now I'd like to share my screen. Before we move forward, I just want to give everyone sort of a chance to sort of stop and reflect and think about what you noticed during that moment of music. What were you looking at? What were you seeing in your mind's eye? What was your heart rate doing? How were you breathing? And how did it feel knowing that we were all sharing music together for a moment? My career has been spent in caring for patients, caring for my colleagues, healing the healer, and then caring for the community at large in many different ways. We're very lucky here in the Boston area, particularly, where the community of music and healers and educators is are all blended together. I frequently consult my music education colleagues, those who are doing music research in the neuroscience world, working with music therapists across the community as a physician who also plays music, because we all don't have the answer. What's been really interesting is there has been always a search for where the musical center in the brain is. And the answer is there is no musical center in the brain. There is just so much going on in our brain that really just absorbs music, embraces music. So it really is that the whole brain is engaged. When you think about what we're doing with our brains when we're playing or when we're listening, of course we're using our ears to hear, and that goes through our auditory cortex to our auditory cortex and through our hearing centers. But also our cerebellum back here is our rhythm section, so we were feeling the heartbeat of the music. And when we're dancing, our cerebellum is going crazy with rhythms. We have our prefrontal cortex that's thinking, where is the music going? When is the music going to go in this direction? Or if we know a song, we're anticipating where the music was going to move to. So that's your executive function. Your sensory cortex, when you're snapping your fingers, or for me, when I'm feeling the strings under my fingertips, that part of your brain is involved. Your motor cortex, which is moving us and telling us how to move our fingers, how to snap our fingers, how to dance. In the back, our visual cortex is working. And then deep down in the older parts of our brain, the limbic system, our memory, our emotions, all of those things are all being engaged all at the same time. So, of course, as a pediatrician, I think about how is it that there are so many connections between music and and education and development, and what can we do to help kids to engage that, but also reflecting in just awe that music is really something that comes naturally to babies. I was just actually in this room dancing with my granddaughter earlier, and she and all of her baby cohorts all have natural rhythm to music. They all automatically start um, bobbing their heads and smiling and dancing. We can use that therapeutically. And this is Brian Jansen, music therapist over at Children's Hospital. For children who may have limited range of motion, they will practice their range of motion more if they're holding rattles and playing to music. And in language, we're music will help kids to communicate with each other, even in nonverbal ways. And of course, social emotional learning is enhanced by music, both by, in this case, playing violin with his father, but also in modulating your emotions, in finding a nonverbal way of expressing yourself, developing resilience, persistence in learning music, cooperation in taking turns, learning the alphabet, learning things that might be hard to learn by just words alone when you add a melody to it, and learning to collaborate and communicate with your peers. So throughout throughout the span of medicine and music, there have been many healers who also are musicians. One that comes to mind for me is Dr. Virginia Apgar, who was the founder of the Apgar scores, which are the numbers that you get as soon as you're born, that rates your color and your respiratory status and your heart rate and your tone. But she was also herself not only a musician, but a maker of instruments. So she was the founder of the March of Dimes. She was one of the first surgeons, female surgeons in New York, or basically in our country. but she was also a violinist and a luthier. And Johannes Brahms was a dear friend of Dr. Theodore Billroth, who was the founder of colorectal surgery and was a real pioneer in a lot of surgeries, thyroid surgery, larynx surgery for cancers. This is back in the 1900s. But first and foremost, Dr. Billroth was a pianist, and he actually was the one who persuaded Brahms to move to Vienna because as the chief of surgery at the University of Vienna, Bill Roth really wanted to continue his music. So he invited Brahms to move to Vienna so that in the evenings they could play music together. So Bill Roth was one of the people who read through all of Brahms's new works and critiqued them during the evenings, but during the day, he would work with young surgeons and read their papers and critique them through that. So there was a parallel between um, his his music and his medicine. And what Bill Roth said is it's one of the superficialities of our time to see in science and art two opposites. Imagination is the mother of both. And then the person who really has helped me shape my philosophies is Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who was first a musician and a theologian. He was an organist and a specialist on Bach and a scholar. But at the age of 30, he heard about the healthcare disparities in Africa, and he trained as a physician. And with his wife, who trained as a nurse, they moved to the the west coast of Africa to Lambaréné, which was a French equatorial Africa at the time, and established a hospital which is still there. He received a Nobel Peace Prize for his work, and his books and his philosophies have been a real guiding light for me and for this orchestra, the Longwood Symphony. So Piper mentioned that I was the president of the Longwood Symphony for about 20 years, but I joined it when I was still a resident at Mass General. We all at that time were looking for ways to pick up our instruments again. We knew something was missing when we were practicing medicine, and many of us realized that it was that we needed to be holding on to our instruments again and feeling our instruments. And so very quickly, an orchestra was formed. Um, I think it went from about 12 to 90 in a year. And ever since then, this orchestra of people from the medical community, physical therapists, speech therapists, audiologists, researchers, doctors, nurses, we've been playing ever since. And um, have found a camaraderie among each other and found that music has been a healing force for us. It's also been a way of really bringing the community together in the medical world. This is probably the only place where people from all of these different hospitals come together once a week to create beautiful music. And it brings together a lot of the academic institutions also in our city. As I mentioned, Schweitzer really was sort of a touch point for all of us. And in 1991, which is the beginning of my presidency for the next 20 years, um, we held a conference thinking about what would Albert Schweitzer do in Boston if he were coming in 1991. So it wasn't going to be that he'd be dealing with malaria and tuberculosis, but the healthcare disparities and the public health crises of HIV/AIDS, homelessness, domestic violence, children's healthcare disparities. And then we said, well, why don't we think about how that links together with Schweitzer's um, philosophies on Bach and reverence for life. And so with Yo-Yo Ma and the Albert Schweitzer Fellowship, the Longwood Symphony, um, all joined together for a 2-day symposium where we reflected on all of these topics, bringing together not just the physicians, but also the clients, the patients, and the staff of organizations that were working in these fields. This culminated in a concert on Saturday night where we invited, again, not just the staff and physicians, but also the clients to the concert. What we learned was something of a surprise to us, which was the concert was a sold out concert of 1,000 seats. but the the people who are homeless and needed to get into their into the homeless shelters needed to be there by 10 o'clock or they would lose their beds. Victims of domestic violence were not going to come to a public space. So there were some very poignant open spaces in this sold out concert. And we learned from that point that we really need to come to the patient, come to the client, come to the community where they're at. And that is how we started the Healing Art of Music program. Since then, we've been working for every concert with a different organization and meeting them and helping them realize how they can raise funds and raise awareness for the needs of their specific organization. And I'm so excited that the LSO is actually going to return for our very first post-pandemic concert to play at the Hatch Memorial Shell on the Esplanade this August. It's been 2 years, and we have been playing on the Esplanade for over 25 years. I think it was canceled once due to rain, and that's the only time we haven't played there. So I hope it's not going to rain that day, but we're looking forward to going back and playing um, for the community. So I came away from all of this learning that I was a better doctor because I played music. I had learned, as I talked about in the development of the child in music, I'd learned better collaboration. I'd learned to listen. I'd found new colleagues. And then I realized that in our community, at the Harvard Medical School, there were people who were in other art forms saying the same thing. So Dr. Suzanne Coven, who has just actually published a book, Letters to the Young Physician, which is a fantastic book. So she said, well, as a writer, that makes me a better doctor. And Dr. Rafael Campo, who's published 6 different books on poetry, he said, as a poet, it makes me a better doctor. And Dr. Joel Katz, an artist, says that my art makes me a better doctor. So each of us found that the having the other side of us, as Bill Roth said, a balance between art and science made us better people and better physicians. And so that's how the Arts and Humanities Initiative came together. We reflected on the role of arts in medical education, how it improves empathy, collaboration, resilience, a comfort with ambiguity, where the young medical student or pre-med might think that everything is black and white. There's always a multiple choice answer to everything. When you come to taking care of an actual patient, it's a lot more ambiguous, a lot more uncertain. The diagnosis of pneumonia in a 2-month-old and the diagnosis of pneumonia in a 92-year-old are completely different, even though the mechanism might be the same. We learn in the arts bifocalism, which is, well, besides my glasses, bifocalism of looking far and looking near at the same time, looking ahead to the trajectory of a patient over the 20 years. I take care of babies all the way till they graduate from college. So when I'm looking at that infant, I need to use my bifocal lens of how are we going to navigate all the way from here till you're 22, but also paying attention to every single small detail of the baby's life as it unfolds. So the arts helps you with that because it's very much like when you look at a blank canvas, what is that going to be when you paint it? When you're about to dive into a symphonic piece of music, what does that sound like note by note, but all the way to 40 minutes later? So of course the arts invite also self-reflection, understanding, and fostering creativity, which is where it all lies. This has actually been embraced by the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, and they just this year came out with the FRAME initiative, the fundamental role of the arts and humanities in medical education. Many of my colleagues around the country have been embracing the importance of the arts and a rebalancing of our work in medicine and now we have the AAMC also advocating for this. What do? We bring our medical students to the museums, and I'm delighted to say that the Museum of Fine Arts is back open and soon will be opening for allowing us to bring our students back there to reflect on what they're seeing, to enhance their art of observation and their communication skills with each other about what they're looking at. Writers, as I spoke about Dr. Coven, but learning to be able to express what you're feeling makes you not only a better physician, but it makes you a better writer of your charts. Art making, this is actually medical students who were about to go onto the clinical wards for the first time, and we gave them the opportunity to express their hopes and fears through a third thing, through a piece of art. So they created the art and then shared among each other their dreams and their worries that they might not have otherwise been felt free enough to share with their colleagues. The museums invite reflection and being present, and art does that. So we invite them to spend time in the museums, and of course, there's music. So I want to pivot now, just for the next few minutes, about what we have been doing during the pandemic, because it's a combination of what we've known, and then how do you change that up and make it so that you can use it during times when we're more isolated. So I love this New Yorker cartoon. This one's dedicated to all the people that didn't believe in me when I was getting started. Again, we look at how we care for the patient, the healer, and the community. And again, interestingly, Albert Schweitzer himself he was forced to return to France during World War I because he was German and he was in French Equatorial Africa. So he was actually interned in a village in France for about 3 years with his wife. During that time, the physician who was caring for the pandemic patients, the Spanish flu pandemic patients, was transferred to another town, and so they looked to Schweitzer to be their physician. And there are many reflections of how what a humanist he was and how caring he was in staying with those patients. He had no instrument to practice on, so he wrote out a paper organ of 88 keys and practiced on his paper piano slash organ until he was able to go back and to a regular instruments. And actually, before he went back to Africa, I believe he played a number of concerts in Europe to raise funds to go back to his hospital. I reached out to a number of my friends around the world to find out what they were doing during this pandemic, because this is really just so different that our entire world is has been impacted by this. It's not a just a local phenomenon. So my colleagues in Stockholm, Taurus Theorel and Eva Horowitz, she's at the Royal Academy of Music and he's at the Karolinska Institute. He's a cardiologist. Um, they spend a lot of time thinking about music and wellness and music and flow. And so their first, and Taurus is a singer and the son of actually two Stockholm Philharmonic parents, musical parents, but his father also was a physician who ended up winning a Nobel Prize. Anyway, I'm digressing, but they reached out to find out the choristers who were silenced. What was it like for them? What were their greatest perceived losses without rehearsals, without concerts? Was it the performing? Was it the learning of the music? But what it really turned out for most of them was the social aspect, being able to make music together and to collaborate. And over in London, Dr. Arian Williamon, who's a musician and works very closely with the King's College Imperial College Medical School. He reached out to find out what the impact on musicians themselves was, not only their working patterns and their income, but how being silenced affected their well-being. And very recently, this last month, Dr. Zatori and his colleagues in Spain and Italy and Canada and the US, they sent out surveys to find out what people were doing with music during this time. And I found this one very interesting. They found that on average, people were spending more time on musical activities, and what what they were playing depended on their what they've done in their past, their musical sensitivities, um, if they're playing music together or they're playing music in musical instruments or listening to music more. That really depended a lot on what their past was. But many people like us have accessed music to increase social interaction and well-being. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the things that we have been doing. Um, we did find the bottom fell out for all of us in the beginning. And, you know, the question was, what are we going to do? How are we going to pivot? How are we going to continue to embrace our music? One of the things that came out in the New York Times was an article about Project Music Heals Us, a program that Andrew Jantz and Molly Carr, a cellist and a violist, started. They had already been playing music in prisons and music for people who were isolated. But when the pandemic came about, they worked with physicians in the intensive care units to be able to play music through iPhones and through Zoom to be able to reach isolated COVID patients. And this resulted in a New York Times article, and it sparked interest all around the country. And so many new programs started up that Andrew is actually coordinating through his Virtual Sounds initiative. One of those places was at Harvard Medical School. Our young medical students started the virtual bedside concerts at Mass General and at Brigham, and they and also at the Holyoke Soldiers Home in Worcester. So they coordinated musicians to be able to play live, but but through their phones um, to isolated patients. And this turned out to be a very healing um, and very effective way of touching patients. My colleagues from the Longwood Symphony were quickly moved to playing chamber music because we can't come together as 90 people. And they started playing outside of Beth Israel, outside of Newton Wellesley Hospital, and um, bringing music to exhausted frontline workers during lunch breaks. And of course, our our fellow alum Yo-Yo started the Songs of Hope and Comfort very, very early. I think it was March of 2020 that he began playing a piece of music every day and inviting the entire world to submit their own songs of hope and comfort. And I think it's under hashtag Songs of Hope and Comfort. Um, you can see that people really responded all around the world. And it was both in the giving and the receiving that this was so impactful. For those of us in medical orchestras, a new entity started, the National Virtual Medical Orchestra. And this is a representation of actually people from about 10 different medical orchestras. There I am over here in the corner. Um, and it's not nearly as much fun, I have to admit. You play your own part, you record it on your phone, and you upload it, and then by the magic of electronics, they pull it together, and it comes out as the symphonic work that you envision that you're doing with your stand partners. But we submitted, I think we played 11 different works, almost one every month, and this music was shared with people around the country. And it also brought together these medical orchestras. We found colleagues that we hadn't ever spoken with who had the same sensibility about what music can do as and how it enhanced our medical care. So it created a new community. But what was the centerpiece for many of us here in the city of Boston was the Boston Hope. Boston Hope started as a field hospital at the convention center. There are 500 beds for post ICU patients to relieve the pressures of the hospitals of the acute care hospitals, so that people could recuperate in this setting instead. And also the other half, there's 500 beds of that and 500 beds for homeless individuals where they could recover from COVID without being out on the streets. Dr. Ron Hirschberg, my colleague here, was the chief medical officer, and he is also one of the founders of the Boston Hope Music Program, because he wisely thought that not only he's a rehab doctor in his profession. He said, you know, not only do we need to help people rehabilitate their respiratory status and their physical status, but it really is their hearts and souls that we need to touch. And so they incorporated mindfulness, meditation, and music directly into the healing programs for the patients at Boston Hope. There's a beautiful team that was created, musicians from the Eureka Ensemble and Windsor Music, physicians from Mass General, educators from New England Conservatory, and music therapists from Mass General. We have a team, and we were meeting every week to care for the patient, the caregiver, and the community. So the first thing that we did was we recreated Boston Hope music playlists. We invited musicians from all over the country, but mainly through Boston, to submit 5-minute pieces of music as musical donations, and we put them together as playlists where the patients could access energy in the morning, engagement in the middle of the day, and evening calm. So we sorted out their donations into 25-minute submissions, and I think there's going to be, you'll be able to see that in the chat and be able to access these, because we now have shared them with the public, and so you can listen to these different YouTube playlists. And patients had tablets that had been donated, and so they were able to listen to music there. But we also found that our caregivers were watching and accessing the music as in addition. One of the pieces that I just wanted to call out to you to look for is the Longwood Chorus. This is a chorus in the Longwood medical area that was created of medical students and people in the medical community. It's run by Dr. Jeremy Faust, who is himself an emergency doctor at the Brigham. So he was a frontline worker. The chorus had started a couple of years before, but the Longwood Chorus published The Bridge Over Troubled Water, where not only did you hear them singing, but it identified each of the singers by what they were doing and how they were helping our community during COVID. So I'll invite you to go and listen to that, because it's just lovely. After 2 months, fortunately, the Boston Hope Hospital was able to close down. We did have an opportunity to meet with some of the musicians who had contributed to this wonderful project. But then we moved on. We said, well, this, you know, the hospital is closed, but what can we do next? Having seen that the caregivers were needing to be treated as much as the patients, the Boston Hope Music Teaching Project was begun. There was a songwriting program where nurses shared their experiences being at the front line, and songwriters helped them to create phrases and lyrics, and then finally songs that were reflected what they were experiencing, and also the creation of the music, but also the singing of the music was healing. And also, we started the teaching project where master's degree students from New England Conservatory virtually taught frontline musicians, doctors at Mass General. And some of these were people who had always wanted to play an instrument but never did. There are some who are like Dr. Kathy May Tran here, who used to play and put her violin and viola down for 10 years. And then when she was in the middle of working with COVID patients, she found that the place that she could heal was to embrace her viola. We had the music therapist work with us on trauma-informed care, so that the students and the educators were trained to to teach in a compassionate way. So the other thing that we did was we actually asked the students and the learners to, the master's degree students at the conservatory and the learners to reflect every week with a different prompt so that they could also track how they were healing. And one of them said, Boston Hope music allowed me an incredible escape from the stress of the pandemic. I'm not sure how it translated back to my work as a physician, but it allowed me to take the emotions of practicing medicine and channel them in a productive way. But then went on to reflect and saying, well, actually, working on the fundamentals of music did have me refocus on what I consider the fundamentals of medicine and the requirement to come back to those and practice them regularly to improve as a clinician. On the other side, one of our master's degree students who you saw in the picture, Luther Warren, he said, well, I know it's supposed to be healing the healers, but it actually helped me to think about what I'm doing. And he's actually a pre-med. He said, there's a happy truth that I've been coming to terms with over the past year, that music and medicine are already in balance with each other. And so that program is ongoing. We hope it's going to keep on going for a long time to come. And then we added, when we're allowed to start playing live, the Boston Hope music at vaccine centers. So we played at Fenway Park. We played at Assembly Row in Somerville. And we played at the Reggie Lewis Arena in Roxbury, bringing music to those people who were waiting for those 15 minutes after they got their vaccines. And for many of them, it was the first time they were hearing live music again. For many of us, it was the first time that we were able to provide that. So I just want to close with a 55-word story. So the AAMC, one of their frame initiatives was to invite caregivers to submit 55 words about something about the pandemic. And this is what I wrote. When the pandemic struck, we were stopped in our tracks. Is music still relevant? Are the arts still relevant? Then the melodies began to flow again. Music is never silenced. We played together again to bring wellness to COVID patients and to restore wellness in ourselves. A way of healing, giving back, restoring our disrupted world. Schweitzer said, grow into your ideals so that life cannot rob you of them. So I think we have some time to reflect on what we learned, what we held on to, what's next. I invite you to put questions or comments into the chat. But before that, I'd like to end with another piece of Bach, and then we'll gather to have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Lisa. On behalf on all of our viewers, I will give you a round of applause. So I actually just wanted to share this one comment, and actually it looks like you have some people clapping in the chat too. We did get this comment in the chat that I thought was just so lovely that I wanted to share with the group. Whether performing music or listening to music during the pandemic, I found that the focus necessary is essential and frees me to be only in the moment. So with that, I would love to transition to the Q&A portion of our program. Please continue to submit your questions for Lisa in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as possible. So I'd like to begin our conversation with this question posed by one of our viewers today, Lisa. Through your research, are some types of music more effective to healing than others? For example, classical versus jazz versus instrumental?
That is a great question. The answer is yes and no. There are times that you really want to hear music that you already know and music that is familiar. Um, we find this particularly for patients with dementia and Alzheimer's, and older patients to be able to find a piece of music that really got you excited or happy when you were 25 years old or 20 years old, playing music of your time. Sometimes that is the most healing. And so that can be in the jazz genre, it can be in, in hip hop or classical. But then there's other times where you just need certain chords, and those transcend any form of music. The fourths and the fifths and thirds, certain harmonies just really we find resonate and cause the brain to resonate in certain ways. And so sometimes just listening to quiet chords that change slowly are more healing.
Yeah, sure. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of a music therapist?
Yes, the music therapist is like a psychologist who communicates with music, but they have so many different roles. And again, when I was talking about how it differs when you have people at different stages of their life. So with babies, music therapy can be helping them to use their motor to coordinate themselves and use their motor better. Sometimes when you have an anxious person, you can play music that is at a certain beat that causes them to breathe at a certain rate. And you can start, sometimes the music therapist will start with, if somebody's, really short of breath and sort of panting, but then slowly bringing the tempo of the music down. And it helps them to bring the tempo of their breathing down as they try to match that. And they use music therapy for people who've had strokes, who are who are learning to walk again. Often they can walk better when they're hearing the rhythm of a guitar or the rhythm of a piece of music, as we talked about, because your brain just, you know, automatically starts to engage your rhythm sections, your cerebellum, and all of that. Sometimes that brings in a lot of other parts of your brain that you couldn't have marshaled just by thinking about it. But with music, you just naturally start to walk in time to the music or move your arms in time to music. So there's many ways that music therapy can be helpful, and it's growing by the day.
Right
I
now.
think one of the things that I think was the most exciting thing that's been going on over the last couple of decades is that the music neuroscientists and the music therapists are working together. Um, because what the music neuroscientists are understanding through their research is then translated to what the music therapists are doing, or vice versa. The music therapist will say, I've always seen this happen with my patients. Why? And then the neuroscientists can go and help us to understand that. So that's
Yeah,
what I feel about this wonderful community that we have.
thank you. So let's see here. Our next question. Is there any research you can share with us on the healing power of collective singing?
Yes. I think one of the links that we're putting into the resources has a number of articles about that. Um, Collective singing is one of these things where people just sharing those harmonies, orally by from their voice and also listening laterally to each other. That's one of the things, and that whole socialization. And so there's been a lot of research on that, and then there's been research on how that is helping people during the COVID times. Um, we're actually excited that, with vaccination, then your chances of of spreading COVID by singing is going to be a lot less. And then actually there's a number of choruses that are singing it, distantly. And so they're able to at least see each other sing and hear each other, but from distances. Um,
Mhm.
so it's
This is actually a great question. So, of course, I think we know the answer to this. How do you incorporate music healing into your life? And also along these same lines, Lisa, do you have any weekly jam sessions? And perhaps this could be a great time to tell us a little bit about your very musical family.
sure. That is a great question. I was 3 years old when I started playing music. My sister was taking piano lessons, and I would clamber up on the piano bench after she had her lesson and play back everything that I had just heard. So it sort of dawned on them that I also could hear music. So I grew up in a musical family of five kids who played two instruments each, and it became sort of this happy little competition. So music really was my first language. I married a violinist named Lin Chang, who those of you in the who are alums may know, because he played a lot with Yo-Yo and Richard Cogan, who became a doctor pianist. Anyway, so we already had music in our family that way. Both of our children are accomplished violists, and my daughter's husband is an accomplished pianist, and so there's a lot of music that happens in our household. But what's been exciting for me as I had mentioned, is Longwood Symphony has been sort of my musical family for now over 30 years. We actually had our very first in-person rehearsal on Monday,
Oh, that's
after
exciting.
15 months, and it was lovely. We were playing Beethoven's Second Symphony, and it's so interesting how a lot of the instincts just come right back. You know,
Mhm.
you're just it's like getting back in the saddle. And so it was wonderful to be able to do that.
Well, thank you for sharing that personal token with us. So this next question from one of our viewers, you've discussed how important and effective practicing and performing art is for physicians and medical students to develop their profession, to connect with others, and to enhance their personal wellness. It seems to me that these effects are especially important for healing and aging patients and in COVID and lockdown. The aspect of social connection is so important. How can we bring these programs to patients more widely? Do you think it's feasible to make art and music part, a more integrated part of the patient care nationally and globally?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of I certain hospitals have really embraced it, like Mass General, for example, and the Brigham, and so there's certain hospitals that embrace this and certain that have not. Um, it comes from the art and music therapy sections, the creative arts. There's creative arts or patient care uh, departments. It's each hospital seems to be a little bit different, um, but I think embracing the arts for anybody really makes such a difference. And I think during COVID times, one of the things that was that bringing healing music to isolated patients, that broke up their time of just listening to their own breathing, and
Mhm.
and listening to their own fears. Music was helpful for that. That's an interesting thing. So the isolated patient is not going to go away. Even when COVID goes away, we've always had patients in isolation, and now we have a way to reach them. So that's going to be something that we can really develop. Um, there are
Mhm.
so many opportunities, I think, that we can start to explore to bring the arts and music to every patient.
Mhm. Great. Yes. So thank you for that great question. Another question here. Are there programs that have the funding to pay the musicians for playing remotely? Professional musicians were hit hard by the pandemic and continue to need opportunities to earning a living through performing. Musicians are often expected to donate their skills that take years to develop.
Thank you for that question. That's very, very important. In the Project Music Heals This program, all of the musicians are paid, and they made sure um, very often it's through grants, and our medical students are. are playing as volunteers because they're medical students, and they're actually writing papers and studying this, and so they're learning. But those professional musicians who are playing are compensated. And in the teaching program, we also made sure that our teaching artists from the conservatory are being compensated. But that is something that's very important. And again, this is such a this really the pandemic has really sort of taken the band-aid off of a lot of things. And one of them is that, yes, the musician, as much as a musician wants to be healing another, has to also take care of themselves. It's the healing of the healer who's a musician.
Certainly. Yeah. Thank
And
you.
actually, I do want to say that one of the things we're looking forward to is the Boston Hope Music is going to try to really honor the teaching artists and the physicians and the songwriting program. We're looking to performing a concert with the Eureka Ensemble in October at MIT. So stay tuned for that.
Oh, great. I'm sure we can find a link and share that with our group today. And I will pose this as our final question. We'll wrap up just a few minutes early, but can you share one particular highlight from your time as president of Longwood Symphony Orchestra that you could share with us?
Oh, sure. I mean, I was president for 21 years, and so it really was a whole sector of my life that I devoted to it. And there are a number of things. Um, and one of them I wrote about in my book was a violinist named Augustine Hadelich, who is now internationally known. But he's has a German name, but he grew up in Tuscany in Italy. And when he was 15, he was already a prodigy, but he was involved in a very bad house fire. So he was burned, and when he woke up, he was in the ICU of a burn hospital with his whole right arm and his face burned. And the first thing they told him was that he'd never play the violin again. And so he went through a lot of rehab, and of course was so dedicated to his craft that he refused to allow that to keep him from playing. And so he went on to Juilliard and became a wonderful violinist. At the same time, Longwood Symphony, just about when Augustine was a graduate student at Juilliard, we were looking for a violinist to play with us, and we're playing a concert for Shriners Burns Hospital. And we did not know his story yet, but did know that he was a fabulous violinist. And so I was the one who was, as president, was called upon to hire him. So then I looked him up and found out this connection of his survival of a burn, and he's going to play at the Burns Hospital. So um, he agreed to go and play for the kids at Shriners Burns Hospital. And I was particularly fond of that hospital because I worked there as a resident. And so he went there and he talked to them about just keeping their eye on the prize and just thinking about what they wanted to do with their lives and how that would help them to heal. But it actually healed Augustine as well, because that was the first time he'd been
Sure.
back to an ICU hospital. Um, and so that story has already struck me, and I've become, we're sort of lifelong friends now.
Yeah,
I follow Augustine's career, but those are the kinds of wonderful journeys that happen in this sort of, the musical and medical intersection. There's a lot of these things are always happening. So that's
certainly. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that very miraculous story. Lisa, on behalf of the Harvard travel team and our alumni community, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks and appreciation, not only for your time, but for sharing your music with us. That was truly spectacular. For those of you interested in traveling on a Harvard alumni travel program, Lisa is scheduled to lead a fascinating trip next year, Symphony of the Senses, celebrating food and music in the heart of Italy. We've placed a link in the chat, but please feel free to contact our office for more details. As soon as you close out of this webinar, a brief survey will appear. We'd be grateful if you take a few moments to complete that. And as a reminder, the recording of this lecture will be shared with you. And finally, we hope that you will join for our next webinar, The River Elbe, the Microcosm of European History, featuring Professor Werner Solers. You can also find the registration link in the chat. Thank you so much and take care.